The Kerbylon project was a dream given form. Its mission, to slip the surly bonds of Kerbal, to explore outer space, to reach for the horizon, to seek to strive, to never fall, to not go quietly into that good night. This is the Kerbylon project. Hello and welcome back to the Kerbylon project. Now, it's been a little while since I've done this. There's been various reasons for that. One is that I've not been well recently. I've not had much energy, I've been missing work and stuff. So what gaming time I've had, I've been devoting to Minecraft, seeing as it's the most popular stuff. But I really am keen on this game as well. The other reason is that I didn't know how to fix the no shadows problem. I've now discovered that. I think I still have a problem with my joystick mappings keep being lost. So if anyone is actually familiar with this game and knows, because I searched the forums for joystick losing mappings, and I never see anything. But anyway, the other reason is because I never really had a mission plan in mind. I've called it the Kerbylon project. And the intro is an obvious reference to the TV series Babylon 5. And at some point, as the game develops and we get more advanced tech and future tech, I really would love to recreate some of the stuff from Babylon 5, like a giant spinning space station, giant warships, etc., etc. But for now, it doesn't really have the stuff in there that I need for that. So I needed a goal, so I've come up with like a short-term mission plan, which might get me 3 or 4 or more episodes based on, how much I mess up or not. And tell me what you think, tell me if you're interested in seeing that. If you can actually think of other more interesting missions other than just land on the moon, land on Minmus, which I'm going to do as part of this, but something a little more. So recently, Jeb Kerman was just hanging out at the top of the launch tower on his lawn chair, drinking his tea, eating his crumpets of the afternoon. Yes, Jebediah Kerman is British, and he noticed off in the distance to the north this strange black smudge. Now, being lazy, he didn't want to have to walk there, so he called up his mates, Bill and Bob. Is it Bill and Bob or Bill and Ben? I've forgotten the name of the Kerbal pilots. Anyway, and they went for a short jaunt to find out what was out there. Now, after that experience, finding this strange black monolith, and being surprised that out of nowhere there was coming a large bombastic orchestra, they've decided to investigate these things and find out, is there other stuff going on? And they've discovered a few things. One is that these things put out a signal called basically it transmits muons. Now, for any physicists out there, these aren't the normal type of muons we're familiar with. These muons actually travel distances and have a half-life of more than a few seconds. And for any further physicists out there who just know that what I just said is complete and utter rubbish, just politely correct in the comments. So they've come up with a detector. They also realise that these things, even though they're small, they show up on radar with quite a large signal. So they decided to develop a couple of extra things. So we'll go over here, and they have come up with some interesting scientific stuff. Now, one is a muon detector. They've got a short-range muon detector, which is what was mounted on this thing. That's what was causing the beeping. And then there's long-range muon detectors. Now, these things are a little bit bigger. But basically this thing, you know, will pick up signals from space. But in addition, they came up with radar mapping. Now, the reason why they want to do this is because Jebediah Kerman was sick of his clones constantly crashing into the surface of planets and the moon because they didn't know how high the terrain was. So he ordered that the boffins, that would be, this guy here is a boffin, the little green guy at the bottom left-hand corner just going out of view. He ordered that they come up with a solution. So they came up with radar mapping. So the idea is that they're going to send up satellites, and it's going to map Kerbin, the moon, and Minmus nice and fully. So when they actually send up the manned missions, then they'll know how high the terrain is, and they can program that into the computers. Now, in addition, it's pointed out that, you know, they asked for volunteers, you know, to see whether there's a Kerbin who would be willing to sit in a mapping satellite for years on end, and there weren't any takers. You know, which shocked the Kerbals no end, because in general Kerbals just volunteer for anything automatically. So they had to come up with a solution to that as well. Now, the best pilot they've got is Jebediah Kerman. So what they did is they opened his skull, they scooped his brain out, they put it through a cheese slicer, then they ran those slices through a photocopier. Then they stuck his brain back in his head. He seems okay, you know. And they took those photocopies and they made a mechanical version of Jeb's brain. And we've got a number of little, they called them mech Jebs for short, and essentially these are autopilots. Now, the Jebediah himself and some of the other pilot Kermans have said that if they're in a capsule, they're never going to rely on the autopilot. You know, at most they might use it for the boring stuff, like orbital maneuvering, you know, stuff like that. But when it comes to takeoff and landings, they're going to be flying it, and they're not going to trust their lives, you know, as cheap as they may be. You know, these are Kermans. They're not going to trust their lives to little electronic gadgets. But when it comes to things like satellites and unmanned probes and unmanned rovers, all we've got is the autopilot, because there is no there are no Kerbals on board to fly the things. So they made a couple of satellites. Very simple little thing, little mapping satellite, and they sent a couple up into Kerbal orbit, or Kerbin orbit. And if we go into the tracking station here, we can see them. Now, we've got one of the satellites is at a height of about 75 kilometers, which is really close to the surface. It's only 5 kilometers above the atmosphere. This is about as close as you can get with an orbit without it being dragged down by the atmosphere. So it's taking high-resolution scans. And it's in a polar orbit, so it will eventually cover every part of the planet. Now, the problem with the problem with a high-resolution scan, of course, is that it's a very narrow band, so it's going to take a while to cover the entire planet. So they've also sent up this one here, which is orbiting at 450 kilometers, and they were the polar orbit one goes over the poles nearly all the time, so it's got a really good scan of the poles. But as it goes around the planet, it was leaving wide bands around the equator. So they stuck this one to a 50-degree orbit, and being higher up, it scans for a wider band. So let's just check in on this, and we can have a look at the map. So here it is, tumbling away. we can temporarily turn on the autopilot, get it to correct itself a bit. Let's kill that rotation. There we go. And the planet is far below us. And we can see the map. Now, this map isn't only the map made by this satellite, this is the map made by all the satellites. I'll try and zoom in a bit on this map during the editing process because it's all a little small. So the bits in black, those are bits that haven't been mapped yet. So as you can see, at first there were these long vertical stripes of black, which the polar orbiting one was leaving. But this one is giving nice wide bands across the equator in like a wavy line like that. We can also look at the map from the north and south poles. But most of the planet is covered. Now, one of the things that they were interested to find was this is Kerbal Space Center. Now, they picked up another space center over here, and they're a bit worried about that because, you know, although there's no actual warfare on the planet, because Kerbals clone each other, warfare wouldn't really achieve much. But this continent here is in direct economic competition with this continent here. So the fact that they've got their own little space center is worrying our Kerbals. So they might want to check that out. Now they are also able to pick up the position of the artifacts. Now they knew about the one that was just to the north of the space center. It's about there on the map. But they didn't know about these ones. So there's another one here to the west. There's one further to the north. Now there's one over there, which is by the other Kerbal Space Center. If I see that one there on the left. Now this has them worried because they thought they were the only ones who knew about these whatever they are, these artifacts, from the aliens which have been dubbed squaddies, because of the strange lettering on the monoliths. But there's also one up there, and there's one there which appears to be right at the top of a mountain. So the first thing I want to do is send some unmanned rovers to check out these other monoliths. And if there's anything interesting going on, they might send a manned team as well. Now, of course, the other thing they need to do is that, they now have surface information for Kerbal, but they also need information for the moon. So they need to get a couple of mapping satellites out to the moon. Also because they've picked up faint muon signals coming from here as well, so there might be artifacts on the moon as well. How pretty can we make this? Oh, no, it's either full flare or no flare. So, I think the first thing we're going to do is get a mapping satellite out to the moon. Incidentally, these mapping satellites don't actually keep mapping when I'm not viewing them. So in order to build up the maps, I have to log into the spacecraft and leave the computer running. But it's not too much of a hardship. I can just have it on in the background. So let us. So here's our mapping satellites. Select. So this thing at the top has a little bit of fuel, but not much. It's enough to do some basic orbital maneuverings once it's arrived somewhere. But this was just enough fuel to get us into Kerbin orbit. We have to get to the moon, so we're going to try a bigger fuel tank, twice the fuel, and that might get us there. So here we are, Moon MapSat 1, and we can talk a bit about the MacLeod. Now the mapping thing won't be active until this stage up there is. Let me just make sure I've got the staging on this right. That one, yes. So we've got various controls. There's the Smart ASSS. Now this lets us do things like point, prograde, retrograde, normal, anti-normal, and radial, and whatever the opposite of radial is, anti-radial possibly. It also lets us kill the rotation. So essentially it's a way of automatically orientating our spacecraft in various ways. The translatron lets us keep surface speed, keep orbit speed, or keep vertical speed while we're doing other stuff. The panic button is useful to have out during launches, because if you hit that, it activates every single stage except for the last one. So essentially it's a way of aborting a launch and parachuting back down safely. Now, these are useful panels, which I'll probably keep up on screen most of the time. Orbital information means I can see my apoapsis and periapsis from this screen without having to switch to the map screen all the time, which means that I can be using this view more often. It's possible at the lower resolutions, or if you don't lean right into your monitor, you're not going to be able to see all these numbers. But, you know, don't worry. I mean, you know, if a number's important and I'm watching it, I'll read them out loud. But it gives all sorts of information, like, you know, our inclination, the eccentricity of our orbits, etc. We also have surface information. Now this gives us our altitude to sea level and our true altitude above the ground. So that's what I will be able to use during landings to actually know where the ground is. So essentially, you know, this is my radar altimeter. It also gives me heading, roll, ground speeds, all sorts of stuff like that. I've got some vessel information, so I can see what my power to weight ratio is. Now I can see straight away that the thrust to weight ratio on this thing is only 1.06. The way this works is a thrust to weight ratio of 1 means you're not going anywhere. It has to be higher than 1. Now on launch, you want this to be at least maybe 1.5, which may not sound like much, but as you burn off the fuel, your ship gets lighter, and then you shoot up more. So I may need to put a slightly more powerful engine on this thing if I'm going to make it to the moon. Because basically the acceleration at the beginning is going to be so slow that this thing, even though it's got twice the fuel the previous craft has, might not actually make it into orbit even. We have a landing autopilot, which I'll talk about if ever I need to land a probe somewhere. We have orbital operations. Now this lets you do things like circularize your orbit, set what you want your periapsis and apoapsis to be. You can transfer to lunar orbit, etc. So that's a very useful one. As I said, I may use the orbital operations panel even when there are Kerbals on board, but I'm going to try and not use the landing, or, you know, the ascent or landing autopilots. But orbital operations, I mean, let's face it, that's the sort of thing which in general computers running anyway. You know, in the real space program. Now we've got a rendezvous module. I've not messed with this yet, but I think it means that you could select a spaceship and, you know, your ship will fly within 1 kilometre of it automatically. Now rendezvousing is very difficult to do manually, but if ever I need to do it with manned Kerbals, I'll try. And we'll always have this as a backup. The instrument landing system is used for space planes. Basically it'll point to the runway. And the Autumn 8, this is a manual interface which lets you type in commands, so we're not going to mess with that at all. I want to increase the thrust to weight ratio on this before we try and take off. So we're going to end flight at this point, return to the vehicle assembly building. Now which engine was that? Was that the... no. I think that was the 215 thrust engine. Now this is the problem because it's the most powerful engine. Well, there is a more powerful engine, but it would probably then run out of fuel almost instantly. I might go with the toroidal aerospike. It's got a thrust of 250, whereas the last one was only 215. And it's a very efficient engine. So, okay, straight away my thrust to weight ratio is 1.25 now. Right, so I've got, so we bring up our ascent autopilot, because as I said, there's no Kerbals on board this, so, you know, okay, I could manually fly it. One of the things the MacJeb does, it does let you manually pilot craft which don't have any people in it. And when it comes to the unmanned rovers flying around the ground and that, I will be controlling them. But in order to, you know, learn what the MacJeb can do, and also because, you know, it's easier, means we can get more done quicker. And also by watching the autopilots we can learn how to fly ourselves. Right, so I say what orbit altitude I want to be at, and seeing as I'm going to go for a translunar burn after this, I think 100 kilometers is pretty good. The inclination wants to be 0. Zero inclination orbit means you are heading east, you know, in the direction the planet is spinning and the way most things are orbiting. You want auto throttle to be on, so that way, if necessary, it won't full throttle. You probably don't want auto stage on. Now for this craft, auto stage might be okay, but basically what auto stage will do is it will activate the stage once the previous stage is fully out of fuel, but it's not necessarily that intelligent. It sometimes stages when it doesn't have to. Also, for preference, I want to do my staging at a point where the stages I'm dropping are either going to crash back on the planet, or fly off into deep space. I don't really want to leave stuff in orbit if I can avoid it. So if I can control when the staging happens, I can make sure it's at a time that I want. Auto warp towards apoapsis. I leave this turned on, so basically if during the ascent it's waiting, you know, it's waiting to reach the apoapsis before it thrusts again, it will automatically speed up time. The other thing it can do is you can time launch to rendezvous. Now, in order for that to work, you have to have done a test launch, so the autopilot knows the flight characteristics of the craft you're flying. But what you can do with that is, if you're trying to launch, and for example I wanted to rendezvous with one of my mapping satellites, and if it knew the flight characteristics of this craft, I could simply choose target, and it would fly up and rendezvous with it, which is pretty amazing. I mean, these are things which are very difficult to work out by eyeballing it, you know. Okay, well, we haven't actually had any flights yet in this Kerbal Space Program. I'm thinking that this information would be less in the way if I moved it over here. That's pretty good. Okay, so we want a orbit of 100 kilometers. We're auto throttling, we're auto warping. I just want to make sure the throttle on my craft is at maximum. Hit engage, and then awaiting liftoff, so when I activate the first stage, everything will should go swimmingly. You can see there the thruster weight ratio is already going up as this thing burns fuel. So the autopilot is the thing flying. The only control I'm going to touch is to stage, and that probably won't be, hopefully, until we're on our way to the moon. I'm watching that overheat meter with a bit of nervousness. So this thing's going to fly straight up until about 10 kilometers, and then it's going to start its turn. Okay, we're above most of the atmosphere now, so we're really starting to accelerate. Now, there isn't much fuel left, but this thing had twice the fuel of the last thing, so I'm thinking that if we can make it to a 100k orbit, we should have enough fuel for a translunar burn. And then the MapSat itself has enough fuel to get into lunar orbit. So the apoapsis is approaching 100k, and so we're going to get some slight pulses of speed as the atmosphere slows us down slightly. But we're going to use very little fuel now until we get to that height of 100k. Because essentially we're drifting, and this thing's waiting until it reaches the apoapsis of 100k before it circularizes the orbit. So you can see there that it automatically time warped. We're still at ×5 and we're approaching 100k. There we go, time has gone back to normal, and once it reaches the height of 100k it will automatically circularize the orbit. There it goes. Hopefully this won't take too much fuel. And there we go. If we switch to the map screen, we have a nice circular orbit at 100k. So let's bring up the smarter SAS and just kill that rotation because it's a little annoying. So now we want orbital operations, and we want to do a transfer orbit to the moon. Now I want to choose what my final periaps at the moon is going to be. It's going to take more fuel to have a higher periaps. Now I want quite a detailed scan of the moon, but I am going to send up more than one of these, because I said a low-level craft scanning the moon gives you a really narrow band. If you're higher up, you can see a wider area. So let's start this at 200 kilometers above the moon. So basically I'm setting what my periaps is going to be at the moon. And here we have a transfer to moon button. Now this is telling what the delta V is needed to get to the moon. Now delta V is a change in speed. You can see that, my current speed is 2,246 meters per second. Now this is saying that I need a change in speed of 842 meters per second in order to reach the moon. Now that isn't necessarily going faster, it just means it, in a different direction. So I simply hit transfer to moon, and it will time warp to the point when the moon rises above the planet, because that's when you want to do a lunar injection burn. So this thing has worked out when and where it needs to thrust towards the moon. Now I might switch to the map screen once we see the moon come up, so we can actually see the orbit being made. There we go. So let's zoom this out. Where's the moon? There's the moon. So this thing's getting ready to burn for the moon. And we just have to hope we've got enough fuel to get there. Wait for it. There we go, and it started thrusting. I mean, as we're burning more and more fuel, our thrust to weight ratio is rocketing up. There we go. So at the moment it's got a periaps of 200 kilometers, which is what I asked for. If necessary, it will do a correction as it gets closer. It'll speed up or slow down if its calculations weren't quite right. Now I don't know whether it will automatically circularize or whether I have to do that for it. So let's just kill that rotation, because that's always annoying. Let us warp until we reach the moon's influence. Now once you're out this far, your speed really drops. You can see the orbital speed is like a tenth what it was before. That means that it takes a lot less fuel to do maneuvers, which is why this thing may only have a few dregs of fuel left, but it's probably enough. Although I may want to stage at this point, because I don't actually want to put the fuel tank into lunar orbit. Although even if it escapes there, it's likely to still orbit Kerbal. maybe I can get the tank to crash into the moon. Now that might be interesting. So let's slow this down, because we're almost in the moon's influence now. There we go. So, I'm going to use the orbital operations, and I'm going to set a periapse of 0. Because I think I've got a little bit of fuel left. Oops, did not mean to put that in there. I meant to switch to this view. Yeah, okay, this thing has a little bit of fuel left, so I'm hoping this thing's going to have the fuel to make it so the fuel tank will crash into the moon. Then I will rely on the map satellite's own fuel to do its orbital operations around the moon, because for its thrust to weight ratio is pretty high. So, got there a rotation. So I'm asking for a periapse of 0, which means it will eventually crash into a crater or a mountain on the moon. So let's do that burn. There we go, periapse is showing at minus 65 meters, which we can confirm by looking at the map screen. So at this stage we are going to... I want to time this right, so let's point this thing in the direction of travel. Prograde. Then we will stage. So that's just the satellite now. We will set a new periapse of... was it 200 kilometers I wanted? 200 kilometers. Now I needed to make sure that we were up ahead of this thing, otherwise we might have thrusted straight into it. So even with the autopilot, you have to sort of think about things and know what you're doing. It's just you're not doing the manual flying. Which incidentally, if any of you were interested in this game, you know, and loved the idea of designing your rockets and flying to the planets and so on, but you're no good at actual controls, like you don't have the reflexes, or the experience, the flight sim experience to actually fly and land and stuff, install MechJeb. I'll put a link in the description. Because then you can play the game and not actually have to fly. And so anyway, right, let's set, we want to do this as early as possible, so let's burn for our periapse. Look at this thing. This thing has a thrust to weight ratio of 31.12. It doesn't have much fuel, but it doesn't need it. There we go, that little tiny burst was enough. So that's now got a periapse of 200 kilometers. So again, I will I can use this thing. I can warp to my periapse, and will give us a lead time of 15 seconds. So this thing's going to automatically speed up the game until I'm 15 seconds away from that periapse. There we go, ×1 speed, approaching the periapse, and I'm just going to have to hit the I just hit the circularize button once we're at the height I want. And this will do a retro burn and put us into a proper lunar orbit. Okay, now this is going to use a little. That's probably the most fuel I'm ever going to need for this thing. Right, position ourselves, and we can bring up the map. Switch to the moon. There we go. This thing has already started its mapping. And you can see how wide that is. That's because we're at 200 kilometers. If I was orbiting at the 75 kilometers like I was back there, then it would be a really narrow strip. Now this thing will collect the map data. Let me make sure it's storing the raw data. It will collect the map data at up to ×10 speed. So currently we're just in an equatorial orbit. I'm wondering now, the debris I think has already hit the planet. It just ploughed straight in and is gone. So it used a little bit of extra fuel in order to do that, but it keeps space neat. Keep space tidy. Dispose of your spent stages. Now one thing you can see though, that even though this is a wide band, there are gaps in it. That's the disadvantage of having a map sat at this height, is you've got a lower resolution scan, but it sort of covers more of the planet. Now I'm thinking I should shift this into a polar orbit. Now there's no way to do that automatically that I've seen, but in order to change the orientation of an orbit, that's when the normal plus and normal minus directions come in handy. That isn't working because I'm time warping. So yeah, so this is the direction of my orbit. This is against the direction of my orbit. This is away from the planet I'm orbiting and towards the planet I'm orbiting. And then essentially this is to the left and the right of my orbit. So if I set to either the left or the right and I thrust, then I will change the angle of my orbit. So I want to get this thing into a nice polar orbit. So all I've got to do is keep this thing now. If you want to do this manually, what you're essentially doing is you're aiming your nav ball at the horizon, halfway between that yellow marker and the other yellow marker. See, that's halfway between. And as you change your orbital angle, those markers will move, so you have to keep re-aiming. But with the smart ASS, it'll do it for me. So let's just do a little bit of thrusting. And you can see there my orbit is tilting. And I want to get it pretty close to 90. Otherwise I won't scan the polar orbits, the poles of the moon at all. See, this really isn't using much fuel, although, well, this thing doesn't store much fuel. These little pods have just enough fuel to do a little bit of orbital, maneuvering. You can change the inclinations a bit, but then that's it. So the inclination's up to 60 degrees. Approaching 80 now. I might just go for a complete 90-degree orbit for now. Slow this down a little bit. I'm looking at the orbital information panel. Just a tad more. There we go, 90.1 degrees. And you can see here on the ISA map sat, it's starting to map up and down rather than left and right. So what will happen is, this thing's going to go round and round in the polar orbit, and the moon will revolve underneath it. Now the moon doesn't, the moon always stays pointing at Kerbin because it's tidal locked, so it doesn't rotate as fast as Kerbin does, so it will take longer for this map to build up. So what I'm going to do is, off camera, I will send another map sat here, probably one to a lower orbit, maybe 100k, and I'll put it at a 45-degree angle, so it's doing a different search pattern than this one. You can see the artifacts don't show up until you've mapped it. So, I'll see you next time when I think we'll start developing an unmanned rover that we can send out to check out those other artifacts on the surface of Kerbin itself. So, see you next time from the Kerbylon project. Over and out.